2 days ago, the New York Times headlined the fact that two of Peru's former presidents are behind bars, one convicted of human rights violations, the other accused of illegally trying to dissolve Congress. A third ex-president may soon join them in the same jail to face trial in connection with one of the largest corruption scandals in Latin American history. On the French news, TV news the other evening, it was announced that the new Colombian president, the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, wants to decriminalize cocaine growing by small landholders, farmers. This has already gone into effect informally in some areas of the country. Colombia is already the largest supplier of cocaine to the United States. So there is, as June said, there's a lot going on down there in South America. Thankfully, we have with us today Professor Cynthia McClintock. Cynthia McClintock is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University. She is the author of Electoral Rules and Democracy in Latin America, Oxford University Press, 2018, Revolutionary Movements in Latin America, the U.S. Institute of Peace, 1998, and Peasant Cooperatives and Political Change in Peru, Princeton University Press in 1981. Our speaker has a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. McClintock is a past president of the Latin American Studies Association. She was a member of the Council of the American Political Science Association and chair of the association's section on comparative democratization, 2003-5. Cynthia McClintock has taught in the Catholic University in Peru, and in 2008 received the Order of the Sun of Peru, awarded by the Peruvian state for extraordinary contributions to Peru. In 2019, she won the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Latin American Studies Association Peru section. I have asked Professor McClintock to speak to us today on the present state of South America as it affects U.S. relations. We're pleased to have you with us, Cynthia, and we look forward to what you're going to tell us.
Well, thank you so much, Don. What a wonderful introduction. That's just lovely. I really appreciate it. And it's great to be here with all of you. And, just as June and Don were saying, it's very, very trying, very worrisome times throughout the world. And unfortunately, South America is no exception to that. Very worrisome in terms of so many issues, whether it's climate change, the drug war, U.S. Latin American relations. So, I do hope I can shed some light on that. As Don mentioned, I am first and foremost a specialist on Peru. In my classes, when I introduce myself, I kind of show myself with pictures of this president of Peru and that president of Peru, and then I say, only problem, they're all in jail. But in any case, it's great to be here with you today. So I don't know whether first slide, please. Is that the best way to do it, perhaps? Great. So that's the introduction. And then we go to the next slide, which is sort of an overview slide of what I'll be talking about today. And the main point in the next slide is, that I don't want folks today to come away thinking that there's never been progress in Latin America. These are amazing countries with tremendously, industrious people, creative people, that have challenges related a lot to the conquest by Spain, indigenous peoples being, decimated, repressed, and then trying to build countries on the basis of that original conflict. And often, as the saying goes, from Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States, often that proximity has not been very helpful. So that first slide, I want to highlight, how challenging the Cold War years were for Latin America. Very, very difficult years where, what we know of it, kind of the liberal international order, it didn't get to Latin America. No, they were very unequal countries and very problematic. And then we really did have, I put sort of 1990 to about 2015, 2016. No, they were very, very good years for Latin America. So I don't want us to lose sight of that. But as I said, now it's extremely challenging, to put it mildly. So the next slide is trying to, the icon of Che Guevara. Again, this is a very, very unequal region of the world, and big surprise that Marxism, with its emphasis on trying to reduce inequality, would be appealing in the region. And because of that fact, that was what said to U.S. governments, okay, we've got to worry about this, and led to what almost everybody believes was an overreaction to the rise of Marxist movements in Latin America. But the toll, as the next slide suggests, it was just horrendous, just horrific in Latin America. There were Marxist insurgencies, but also these very, very repressive governments. So death tolls that Nicaragua, the death toll during the course of the Cold War was greater than the U.S. suffered in every single war that we ever fought since independence. So these were just in per capita terms. So these are just a horrific, horrific death toll that, again, left huge scars on so many of these countries. It also left quite a lot of guns often in the region that often also came from the United States. So perhaps the nadir in terms of, and we're going to be talking quite a bit about leftist U.S. presidents. So it's important in the next slide, I think, to keep in mind what was probably for most of the presidents that we're talking about today are old enough to remember these events from the Cold War, and the U.S. Support for the military coup in Chile. Complicity in that military coup was one of the events that leaders like Lula, like Petro, have cemented in their mind, and we have to keep that in mind when we look at why in the world Lula is, courting and having a state visit to China in 2023. But as I said, this is the next slide. Very, very happily, things really began to turn around at the end of the Cold War, and we began to see this liberal political order that I've mentioned actually emerge in the region, and country after country went from military dictatorship to electoral democracies. So people were excited to vote. One person, one vote, a sense of equality for the first time. And I have had the privilege of monitoring many elections in Latin America, and most Latin American countries established national electoral commissions, and for the first time, perhaps, after the events, here of 2020, we can appreciate that, it's not that easy to have an election that people consider free and fair, throughout the country. And these countries really did manage that for a long time. With it, I have this slide with OMPE. That was one of the branches of Peru's electoral commission, and kind of trying to set up ways to do this that would be seen as legitimate. And almost all the Latin American countries did that, as the next slide indicates. So this is this dramatic shift to democracy after about 1975. Where it's sort of apex around about 2008 into the early 2010s, with virtually every country except Cuba having reasonably democratic elections. But then what we're going to talk about later, this regression into authoritarianism after about 2016. And not only did we see advances towards democracy, but as the next slide suggests, I think we began, this slide shows the countries in green are the countries according to Freedom House that are fully democratic, and the yellows are okay, they're trying, sort of. So you can see Latin America really advancing relative to the rest of the world by the 2010s. And then the next slide suggests that it was not only advances towards democracy, but real achievements in terms of their economic development, greater equality, greater schooling. So dramatic. No, this is, as you can see, double the number of years, average years of schooling per person, GDP per capita up something like 35%, over the course of those times. So tremendous advances. And then also the next slide shows declines in poverty too. So this is all pretty dramatic. That was at a time when poverty and inequality in many parts of the world were only increasing. So these are real achievements. So again, I don't want people to leave today saying, "Oh, it's hopeless," right? Because it's not. We can see these improvements. But again, what happened? What happened after about 2015? So these next slides, and unfortunately, the rest of my presentation is going to highlight all of the problems. So obviously the pandemic. The title, political polarization, and I think that's appropriate because we're going to be all the countries that we're talking about this morning have so leaders classified as leftist leaders, but that kind of sidelines a key point too, which was that runner-ups in these elections, at least Venezuela, of course, didn't have anything like a competitive election, but Colombia, Peru, Brazil, the runner-ups were all Trump-like Republicans. So these are increasingly polarized countries where it's difficult for the presidents to achieve their goals. So what happened to intensify polarization in Latin America? I mean, some of it is similar to what happened around the world, and the example of Trump certainly emboldened a populist right. Kind of Bolsonaro is the classic example in Brazil, a president and a candidate who really modeled himself after Donald Trump. And then why did Trump emerge? The problems of social media, the capacity to kind of galvanize a base through fake news, these kinds of problems that we've seen, challenges that we've seen in so many countries. And then polarization, the pandemic, of course, led to so many frustrations that led to a desire for change. And there were presidents who were more conservative. So some of this was an anti-incumbent move, but growth was lower, poverty increasing, and then obviously people looking and saying, public health, we've got to do more. This is just catastrophic. And we have to give more money to the government so that they can improve public health. So I think that was, sort of very, obviously lots of variations, but more or less, what was going on. So the next slide is a very sad photograph from Brazil. And some of you may know the toll of the pandemic per capita was worse in Latin America than any region in the world. It was actually Peru that by official statistics had the worst death toll per capita in the world. But virtually every country, I think it was in part because they were more globalized than, say, African countries. So tourists would come in from Europe early on during the pandemic, so we had all these connections, all this travel, and that led to, elites being infected. And then, because domestic workers, all of the people intermixing in the cities, people then going back home and infecting their friends. So it was just a very, very sad situation. And then the public health, you may remember early on scenes from Ecuador, just bodies in the streets, just total incapacity of the public health system to deal with the pandemic. So, this toll was just very severe and obviously led to a lot of the countries too having pretty bad, severe lockdowns, draconian lockdowns. So just lots and lots of frustrations of suffering, but no success against COVID-19. So next slide, please. And then economic growth wasn't doing very well, even without the pandemic. And then you look at that, basically zero economic growth since 2018. And I think Don mentioned that Latin America has become increasingly, South America in particular, and I've sort of, the title was Latin America, but we're talking about South America. And it's important to note that whereas Mexico, Central America, most of those countries are still, very tied to the United States in their trade patterns. Mexico, a lot of the Central American countries, a lot of manufacturing destined for the United States, so competing with China. for the U.S. market. But the South American countries have remained heavily raw material producers, as I think June mentioned most recently, lithium, which is sort of Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, possibly a little bit Peru. But no, China is importing all of those raw materials, but growth in China began to slack off, and of course the pandemic. So South America was hit particularly hard. So been tough years there. Quite a lot of the growth after about 2000 was due to this skyrocketing demand from China. So next slide, please. So you can see here that this tragic, the gray and the blue don't come across very well. The top line is the increase in poverty, and then the lower line is the increase in extreme poverty. So obviously this is not the direction that we want these numbers to be going in. So again, big surprise. Why increasing frustrations? Why increasing support for the left? So very, very, very challenging time. So next slide, please. So this is to kind of introduce a little bit, what I began our discussion this morning with, the fact that, kind of beginning with the Spanish conquest, there's ethnic cleavage throughout Latin America, where indigenous peoples have been, conquered by the Spanish. The populations are decimated. People are forced to work in mines to get the gold and silver out for the Spaniards. This beginning of extractive economies. And then, of course, through the centuries, a lot of intermixing. So, I have the photograph of this family in part because I've kind of wanted to highlight. We often see photographs of indigenous peoples, but most of Latin American countries now, again, there's a little bit more mixing than that. So there are a lot of people who are not sort of descendants of the Spaniards. They're mixes of all kinds of different peoples, a little bit of Asia, a little bit of Africa, a little bit of this and that. And yet they're really not usually represented, at the presidential level. Most of the presidents are original descendants from the Europeans. And I think that's important to note in terms of, this, again, polarization, the sense of being left out during the pandemic, when there was a reference to corruption, and there were a lot of scandals about who's getting the vaccine first. And you get these, sense of the VIPs, and they're the descendants from Europeans, and what's happening to us. And so the intensification of these ethnic cleavages, and in the 2021 election in Peru, I think throughout Latin America, the sense of, okay, we really like somebody who represents us, who's one of us. And that doesn't necessarily mean indigenous. Indigenous is something a little bit different. We usually hear about indigenous peoples and their conflicts with extractive industry, but the issue is a little bit slightly different in terms of wanting a president who represents us. So next slide, please. This is just to kind of highlight what was going on in the 2021 election campaign in Peru, which I think is sort of emblematic of the problems in quite a lot of these elections. It was an extremely difficult election. Peru's had problems for a century or more with building strong political parties, having trust, turnover, institutions. In 2021, there were 18 political parties competing in the first round of the election. And how I've described it is that this is April 2021, vaccines had not arrived in the country yet. People still couldn't talk with each other about the candidates. The pollsters couldn't get out into the countryside to poll. The candidates weren't really allowed to campaign to any degree. So it was a very, very problematic election, trying to have an election amid a pandemic. And it's always hard if you've got 18 parties in the first round, but usually that number would kind of narrow to maybe 5 viable candidates, but it didn't. And so you had this problem where, tragically, just by less than 1 percentage points of the votes for the runner-up. So next slide, please. This I selected this slide to show, the consternation that the majority of Peruvians had with the results of the first round in that election. Again, most Latin American countries now have runoffs for, that my electoral rules book is actually about runoff and the introduction of runoff in order to avoid the election of candidates at extremes. And I wanted to highlight something positive that's happened in the region, the fact that they were able to change rules, to have a new rule that accommodates the fact that there are more political parties and the desire for new parties to enter the arena. But at times runoff isn't enough. And in this particular election with the fragmentation, two candidates at ideological extremes who didn't have broad popular support ended up going into the runoff, and Peruvians had to choose between Castillo, who's there at the left, and Keiko Fujimori, who's long story, but also reviled by the majority of Peruvians, giving the center, everybody else saying, this is not what we wanted. So that kind of set Castillo, who ultimately won the election, up for failure, in my view. So next slide, please. So here we are by December 2022, just in turmoil, and again, an election that was not legitimate for so many Peruvians, and then corruption, which allegations, this attempt at closing the Congress by Castillo, who just was totally, not up for the job of president. He never thought he'd be president in a million years. All of a sudden, he's cast into this job. He's impeached. The Cruz is notoriously, 5 different presidents since 2018, and then people saying, Boluarte, who are you? We never elected you. The security forces were abusive, were repressive. This is not legitimate. We want a do-over of these elections. We want something better. We're angry in general. And the worst violence that Peru has experienced, that was not clandestine violence by Shining Path, perhaps forever in the country's history. Some 60 deaths amid the confrontations, almost all deaths by the security forces. But I do want this, did choose a slide which shows that the protesters were not what we would consider peaceful. They were trying to, quote, take over Lima. They took over airports. It was a very, very challenging confrontation, and there's still disturbances in the country. There's still a great deal of frustration, and the vast majority, more than 80% want early elections, and the Congress is digging in its heels. So it's a very, very tenuous situation that all of us who know the country worry about tremendously. So next slide, please. So there were also elections, fortunately for Colombia, later. Oh, so that should be, fall 2022. We're not in fall 2023 yet. So Petro was elected mid 2022. And he, again, by that time, no Colombians were vaccinated, and it was a legitimate election. But as I mentioned, the right was the runner-up in that election. Petro has also, had a big challenge trying to develop something like a majority, in Congress. He is a former guerrilla leader. So again, remembers for him the events of the Cold War. U.S. interventions are very, very salient. And obviously, the United States was concerned with his election. I think the Biden administration has done a terrific job trying to engage with Petro. Colombia has long been the closest U.S. ally of the South American countries with the United States. That all began, as I think Don mentioned, due to the drug war and support beginning way back in the Clinton administration for Colombia trying to fight guerrillas and drugs. So it's been a long-standing alliance. The former President Duque is here in the United States at the Wilson Center right now. So this is a close relationship. And obviously the Biden administration would like that to continue. But as Don mentioned, Petro has been very, very clear that he believes the drug war has been a catastrophic failure. And Colombians agree with that. And virtually everybody I know who's followed the drug war agrees with that. The question is what to do about it. So these are a few slides that I hope will give you a sense of why my friends and I all see the drug war as a very, very tragic failure. So these are the figures for the drug war budget. As you can see, funding only going up over the years. This is if we took this back to 1990, you'd see a similar trend, just up, over the years. And then the next slide will show you a little bit the results that we've had from this. So if you could, this is of course not what we want. The idea of the drug war is reduce supply. If you reduce supply, that will increase prices and that will reduce demand. Despite all this expenditure, this is not what has happened. The blue columns there are for coca cultivation in Colombia. And as you can see, despite all this spending, a couple of oscillations here, but basically no decrease that is the goal of all of that spending. So there's a reason why Colombians are frustrated. The coca farmer earns roughly 4 times as much from producing coca as any other crop. So it's very difficult to get, poor farmers away, from the coca when the prices are so much better for any other crop. It's also really, really easy to export. It's, coffee, other crops, they have to usually go out by vehicle out to the ocean and up, planes come in, get it up, it's all. So this total failure to meet the goal of reducing supply. So next slide. So this is for Mexico, of course, but the basic problem, this huge demand, in the United States for drugs. It's said that the only law that drug producers and traffickers respect is the law of supply and demand. So next slide, please. And then, of course, this is the goal in the United States, obviously, for the drug war is to reduce deaths. And that has not happened. Of course, a lot of this in recent years is fentanyl, but as you can see earlier on too, there was just no positive results from all of this. So that's why, and Petro is actually following in the footsteps of many, mostly former Latin American presidents who are so frustrated too by the drug war. So, the need, I think, for big debate and discussion in the United States about what to do. So next slide, please. So Brazil, and again, my friends and I were very relieved that Bolsonaro did not win in 2022. Once again, this is after COVID, so it didn't have the problems of Peru's elections, but it did have the problems that I've mentioned of intense polarization, with Bolsonaro doing much better than expected in the Congress, so limiting what Bolsonaro can achieve at home. And I think next slide will show why my friends and I were pleased to see the re-election of Lula. There are a lot of things most of us are not thrilled about with respect to Lula, but remembering his successes on deforestation in Brazil and his willingness to go to bat. And he was very, very active in international fora, trying to build bridges, trying to achieve an accord. He ultimately was very helpful to what a couple of years after he left office became the Paris Accord. When he went to Egypt for the international climate negotiations just after his election in December of last year, he was welcomed as a conquering hero. We're back. We're going to be able to get something done again. So there was tremendous excitement about that. And the next slides will show, he was president of Brazil 2002, 2010 before, and managed to have sort of be very active in the international arena, but be friendly with different U.S. presidents. So obviously, he and Bush got along, and he and Obama got along. So there were these senses of, hey, this is a friendly guy, this is a congenial guy. But as the next slide will show, I'd say my friends and I were worried about, as you may remember, Lula visited also with Biden, but it was a day. It wasn't a state visit. It wasn't, they were friendly. Lula was, made jokes about the parallels between, the protests, the problems of January 6th in the United States and similar events in Brazil. But no, this was a 3-day state visit, lots of agreements with Lula, saying he wants to help with negotiations in Ukraine. This got a sense that, hey, let's think about this a little bit more carefully. And just, again, Brazil is now China's #1 trade partner. So just not clear. I think most of us would like Lula to work a little bit more on trying to bring, leftist leaders together in Latin America and South America, maybe issues like the drug war, a little closer to home, but obviously it's very early on in Lula's term, and it's kind of, let's wait and see a bit how this goes. But as I said, I think my friends and I were worried, about the closeness that these two leaders showed in this recent visit. So next slide, please. And we're more, we're so depressed and frustrated. Venezuela, some of you may know, was once one of the most democratic countries in Latin America, wealthiest country, in Latin America in the 1970s. And, Hugo Chavez is elected for the first time in 1998, after tremendous difficulties in Venezuela related to fall in prices for oil. Venezuela is tremendously dependent, of course, on its oil. It has the #1 oil reserves in the world, which is why China has been so interested in the country and loaned it so much money during the years. And Chavez had the good luck to be governing during a time of very high oil prices, and he was able to, achieve quite a bit of anti-poverty programs. He was able to co-opt a lot of countries throughout the region. Had a lot of support, was elected, re-elected. Then overstayed his welcome 2012 elections. He was already very ill with cancer, but he still managed what most people believe was, to win more or less. The election was skewed, but he would have won because he had been, with this large pots of money that he had from the high oil prices, was able to achieve greater economic reductions in poverty, in the country. Sort of modeled himself also as charismatic, modeling himself after Simon Bolivar, and having that kind of appeal, in a country, again, with great severe ethnic cleavages, and he himself, not of a very mixed descent. But then, he died of cancer, and the vice president, Maduro, assumes the presidency, claims election, which was very disputed in 2013, and Venezuela begins to go off the cliff. The election not being perceived as legitimate, there are protests, the repression is severe. Obama begins to, increase sanctions against individuals in Venezuela, and oil prices tank. There's the production, because of mismanagement, putting cronies into positions in the oil company, everything begins to go downhill. And Venezuelans begin to emigrate in huge numbers. So this is the next slide, please. So the exodus from Venezuela is unprecedented in Latin America. It's the second biggest exodus after Syria in the world. Ukraine is catching up right now, but just a massive exodus. It's something now like a quarter of the population of Venezuela has exited. A lot of it to Colombia, of course, creating tensions and issues for Colombia. Increasingly in recent years to the United States, Biden has granted temporary protected status to Venezuelans, but no, just it's an indicator of the desperation of Venezuelans in a country where there was no food, no medicine, and severe repression, and so little chance for democratic transition. So next slide, please. In my own view, there was a chance in 2019. You may have heard of, remember Juan Guaido, who claimed interim presidency in the country, and there were this what I see as kind of a botched effort by President Trump to get a democratic transition, in Venezuela, but it failed, and right now, Biden seems to be worried that it'll be just very, very difficult, and isn't putting. He's got, of course, lots of things on his plate, and we're not very optimistic right now about a democratic transition to Venezuela. Although you never know, but we're not very optimistic. So, final slide, please. So again, I want to bring home that. Right now, South America is a tinderbox. It's very, very worrisome in so many ways, but we should not lose hope. We have had decades of progress, both in terms of peaceful democratic politics, in terms of achievements in economic growth, and at a time when relations between U.S. and Latin America were pretty cordial, if not warm, in some countries. So we have to keep that in mind as we worry about today's multiple crises in South America. So thanks very much, and I look forward to your comments, your questions.
Hello, and thank you. I am so pleased at your wonderful overview of the 4 countries that you've emphasized, and in particular, the way that you end with a little bit of optimism, where it's a very trying time for these countries, as you show, because of the polarization. And I think that sort of, in a way, represents America as well at this moment in our lives. So I would like to ask you a first question, if I may, which is, in your feeling, in your mind, have the days of the United States just coming in and changing regimes the way they did in Chile, for example, are those days over? Or do you still feel that there's this strange possibility yet?
I think those days are over. Yes. Now the role of China is very different, from the role of the Soviet Union, and the Latin American countries themselves are also. With economic growth that I showed, tends to come sort of greater professionalization, greater sophistication. So I'd say, again, first point, the Soviet Union's appeal was basically an ideology about social justice in a region that was so unequal. So people like Che Guevara are intellectuals, but they're looking at this inequality and saying, this is terrible. Something's got to be better. And so there were lots of differences between, Soviet Union, China, different models, but there was an ideological appeal, what we call, political scientists call soft power, that the Soviet Union had because of that. And China doesn't have that. I mean, they try a bit with the Confucius Institutes, but in Latin Americans are pretty sophisticated. They know that China is a repressive country. There's not, in my experience, this sort of sense of, the authoritarian model can work. No, not really. Soviet Union also had this military power that could protect Cuba, so in particular, and they weren't that willing. We talked a bit about Chile. They weren't willing to go to bat to Allende, and in the geopolitical conflict, they had Cuba. It's 90 miles from Florida. What more do they really need? China is economically so engaged, right? And in that sense, it really is an alternative. If the Soviet Union had gone to bat for Chile, a lot of things might have been quite different. I mean, China really, we start that lithium, for example, the copper. No, China really wants all of this, and they've got a geopolitical edge too. So they are a recourse. Venezuela, I mean, one of the reasons why there was no transition in Venezuela, I think it was mentioned in the introduction, Russia stepped in to evade U.S. sanctions against Venezuela's oil. Russia didn't need the oil, of course, but then they sort of resold it under the table to China. So there's also that alliance, which doesn't help matters. And China has the money to kind of say, I mean, they loaned at one point, it was $60 billion to Venezuela. It was more than any other country. They wanted that tie. They want their money back. They like that foothold close to the United States. So they're much more engaged. And then by the same token too, back in the days of Chile, the U.S. has couple of ties, the CIA particularly, it's really not the United States. CIA has a couple of ties in the Chilean intelligence apparatus and military. Nowadays, the Latin American countries, we're talking about larger numbers of people who are much more sophisticated, who know there are alternatives, who are bargaining, who are also worried about the International Criminal Court. They've got their own interests. So it's, that was one of the things that people were hoping for with Guaido in Venezuela would be, okay, some of those people will defect, but it's a lot more complicated in 2023.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Peter, have you got a question?
Thank you very much for all that, Cynthia. We've talked a lot about the leaders and the presidents. I'd like to ask you a little bit about I guess, kind of the social capital. What's happening or what is needed in terms of development strategy that is not just focused on the financial markets and trade, but on the welfare. And tied to that, can you speak a little bit about the civic agency of groups, below the party, not the parties, but the kind of cooperatives or civic bodies? How much of that is a factor in, let's say, Peru, to pick one so well?
Right, great, thanks. Yeah, no, really, both terrific questions. I think in general, civic society actors, and this relates back to the previous questions, are much more active than they were 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, they're really, when I began in Peru, I'd say there's virtually no civil society that to speak of in any meaningful word. I mean, there were sort of surveys that kind of doing comparisons, but the only kind of civil societies that they had were sports clubs. There are plenty of soccer clubs, but beyond that, there was almost nothing. Nowadays, they're really quite active civil societies, obviously apart from countries like Venezuela, where they've been hopelessly repressed. But in the countries that are still democratic, there's a wealth of organizations that are thinking about, well, first of all, the universities are active, institutions that try to protect journalists, institutions that are anti-corruption, institutions that are trying to focus on anti-poverty issues. I think in terms of the United States government, some of the programs that my friends and I liked the best were the support for the anti-corruption efforts. These were focused in Central America, but efforts with the United Nations or the Organization of American States to provide sort of forensic support, other kinds of judicial support to countries' judiciaries, sometimes protection. I think we begin, corruption has obviously been a horrific problem in lots of countries, especially Peru, but efforts to, so, I mean, right now, Peruvian presidents are, former president actually had a op-ed in a U.S. newspaper saying, no, Peruvian presidents have not been charged. There are all these accusations running around, but nobody's really made formal charges. So kind of helping judiciaries get to this stage. And there's this problem now of kind of blowback because there are allegations without formal charges. And it's just sort of such a mess. So unfortunately, in my view, Donald Trump cut those budgets. And when elites, former presidents were angry about the anti-corruption efforts, they tried to close those groups. And Donald Trump didn't care, thought that was fine. But no efforts to restore those. Personally, I would like to see more NGOs that focus a little bit more on what to do about ethnic discrimination. There have been quite active women's rights groups, and Latin America has actually been quite successful in electing women presidents and electing more women to the Congress as well. But kind of in terms of, again, bringing people of real color into the political arena, it's fallen short. So kind of efforts to really look at that, I think, would be helpful. And of course, anti-poverty and sort of the different efforts for at-risk kids there. I'm familiar with one or two, again, especially in Central America, because more of our support in recent years has been directed to Central America. But there's some terrific efforts that get at the grassroots to help kids stay in school. And then go to university. Oye in Honduras is the one I'm thinking of. So so there really are, but I think there could also be a lot more. It's still, again, compared to the US, there's still a long way to go.
Thank you.
Boone, how about you?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions that have come in, so let me ask those. One is, what countries do you see in Latin America that have the strongest democracy? And the other is, in terms of resources, how did it that the United States has let this happen, that China has sort of gotten the lead in many of these situations?
Great, lots of terrific questions here. Best democracies, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Chile. They historically had the best democracies, so there's something to say for sort of democratic stock and continuity. Smaller countries, perhaps that helps. Uruguay, really a stellar democracy on almost every dimension. Costa Rica, many of you probably traveled there. It's just a beautiful, beautiful country, worked really hard on the climate change issue, a real leader on that. Chile, current president is Gabriel Boric, who's struggling in a lot of ways, but they did build back their democracy. Again, historically, it was a strong democracy. And, among the newly elected group of leaders, I think for my own taste, Boric has a lot of pluses. And I think it would be great if we could kind of have a better, stronger U.S. relationship with him and see what that might do to kind of improve ties. How did China get this foothold? Well, I think it was part of the larger story, right? There was a period of time when I was among the many people who said, okay, China grows economically and modernization theory, and it's going to democratize it. We kind of believed that, economic development would bring greater opening. And of course, that didn't happen. And then, of course, U.S. businesses wanted the market in China, this huge market. So they were eager to go in. And it wasn't like the Soviet Union. There was no business lobby saying, hey, let's get along with the Soviet Union. So I think that was one factor. And the United States, this goes back to the earlier question, the United States can't really step in and say, no, the United States right now, Biden administration, no, don't use Huawei. Well, China sells all these things cheaply, and the U.S. can't go, no, you're not going to buy, cheap Huawei. It just doesn't, beginning in about, 2000, that was just not going to happen. You can't tell countries, don't buy this or that. They're sovereign countries, right? So we have to be offering stuff. And I think too long we kind of took Latin America for granted. if you look at a map of US aid around the world, no, it's been, first of all, foremost, of course, it's Iraq and Afghanistan. But we also have historically given a lot more last 25 years to Africa. So we sort of took a lot of Latin America for granted, I think, and didn't try very hard.
Tyler, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Cynthia, for a wonderful summary of what's going on down there. Zeroing in on our foreign policy, that is US foreign policy vis-a-vis Latin America. Okay, first Venezuela and then Brazil. Now, in terms of Venezuela, as you know, there were rumblings a few months ago about an effort on our part to perhaps open up the spigot a bit on Venezuelan oil exports, which I found to be very interesting. We've heard very little about that subsequently. What we have heard, though, is that apparently the level of corruption in PDVSA, which of course, you know, is the Venezuelan national oil company, is just immense. I mean, billions of dollars siphoned off and drained from PDVSA, which is, you know, now producing less and less, et cetera. How does that PDVSA issue get resolved, if it does get resolved? And are we in the US really making an effort to try to perhaps, you know, have a little bit more Venezuelan oil spilled out to the international markets than before? And then I've got but go ahead with that. And then I've got a second question about Brazil. So.
Well, I agree with you 100%. No, it's just tragic what's happened with PDVSA and the total politicization, putting cronies in office, the flight of all of the technicians, the collapse, decimation of oil production, and what is being produced was, you know, going out to Russia and then China, as I mentioned. And yeah, I agree 100%. I think the Biden administration sort of put its foot in the waters, and in part because of Ukraine, I would like to have the oil coming back to the United States. I think that the Biden administration is just nervous. You know, they get a lot of blowback as soon as the administration made that opening. You know, there's criticism from, you know, the Republican Party and also, you know, people in, you know, in the Democratic Party of, you know, are you relaxing the sanctions against Venezuela? Kind of the you know, there's a segment that believes that the sanctions will work, and so we don't want to reduce the pressure on Venezuela. And then, of course, there's always the question of kind of Florida and the Florida vote, and there are now quite a lot of, you know, Venezuelan immigrants, and they're friendly with the Cubans, and so there's always that kind of domestic politics issue. And I think the Biden administration, again, this is just my take on it, and I don't really know what the case is here, but I think that they don't. What, you know, why they step back. I think they are fearful that a little bit like Obama's rapprochement with Cuba, that Obama really tried hard, and, you know, then he didn't get the results that he wanted in terms of anything like a democratic opening in Cuba. So I think Biden fears he might invest a lot of capital effort, get criticism, and then not have anything to show for it. I would personally like to see him try harder, but I can understand why he steps back. Again, he's got a lot on his plate, but no, I think because there's so much corruption and there's been so much money at stake, and again, China and Russia bailing Venezuela out, he fears that if he's not represented, his party is not represented, he could go to jail. So it's very challenging, I think. But I agree with everything you said, Tyler.
And just quickly, vis-a-vis Lula's visit to Beijing, that caused, as you know very well, a big flap. And I'm wondering, is there any, though, practical result of that trip that would make us kind of think, gee, things really are perhaps getting off balance in terms of Brazil's relationships with us and China? In other words,
yeah.
Did anything really significant come out of that other than the bad vibes that we seem to be interpreting, you know?
Right, exactly. Fortunately, I don't think so, really. I haven't looked. They signed something like 23 different agreements,
Right.
but to the best of my knowledge, not really. I mean, I see it a little bit as again, Lula can't get that much at home done at home. So he's grandstanding. He's hoping this is going to go down well domestically, making peace in Ukraine. That he himself has always had these pretty grand ambitions in foreign policy, but I think he could. I mean, my hope is that he'll come back home and begin to say, okay, let's get realistic here, and that there won't be much follow-up. My fear is that, if he decides to follow up with all of this, that he'll be neglecting things where he could have a real effect. Again, there's so many problems. Again, Venezuela, for example, where he could really have a positive effect, perhaps drug war, where he could have a positive effect, not just igniting debates, things closer to home, or just Brazil's problems. It's not going to be easy for him to achieve those kind of because deforestation, of course, went right back up under Bolsonaro. So just getting that done at home is not going to be simple. So, but I don't think there were borders crossed that or it can't be regained, from the trip. But again, it's not what we wanted to see, or what my friends and I wanted to see. But it's pretty
Thank you.
early to tell. It's very early in his term now, so we'll see.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
A question I might have is what residue, if any, is there from Spain being so involved in the early days of this part of the world, and where is it now?
Well, that's a good question. There has been quite a lot of immigration to Spain. They have quite a lot of migrants from Latin America, but I'm not aware of major initiatives. I mean, I think for a period of time there was perhaps sort of like those early years, the 2000s, or the European Union being seen as, okay, maybe this will be sort of a balance with the United States. And there are times, again, like the peace, I didn't mention the peace accord in Colombia, and also some of the efforts by, in Venezuela for democratic transition. Often the Scandinavian countries will play a role. But I'm not aware of sort of major foreign policy initiatives by Spain. But it's sort of a good question, whether in part because of the legacy, they kind of there is a move in some of the Latin American countries. You can imagine, just sort of like a lot of the countries have kind of the Spanish independence, sort of moving away from early Spanish leaders, like Spain, right there, the colony. But anyway, good question. Thank you.
Well, there's so many countries that speak Spanish.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely.
Anyway, Peter, you have a question, I see.
Yes, I want to come back to the U.S. foreign policy perspective, and I wanted to ask if you could comment on how effective are the Summit of Democracies and the Americas Summit, which have been happening over the last year with Latin America on several occasions, and tie that with the work you've done on electoral systems. I think you've done some work on ranked choice voting, and you mentioned the runoff type of reforms. And a little bit of context there is I happened to look at the Department of State's website and saw a recent speech that Wendy Sherman gave university students in Buenos Aires. And she really, really went to town on our common challenges in trying to reinforce democratic norms and behavior.
Well, terrific. Yeah, the summits of the Americas, began under Clinton, and it was one of the hallmarks of kind of this new era that I've mentioned. And personally, I think overall it was a wonderful development. The Organization of American States, of course, is the institution that brings Latin America, the U.S. and Canada together, but it's not the presidents. And so the summits bring the presidents together. And they sort of began under Clinton, and there was tremendous sort of consensus. Again, everybody's happy as all these positive years. But then under Obama, I think for the first time, I mean, this is my take on things, and you could probably find a lot of different takes, but under Obama, the Latin American countries really began to find their voice, and they began to really kind of get together on issues that they wanted to work on with the United States and try to highlight. So one was the drug war. With Latin American presidents saying, let's really talk about this. This is not working for us. This is creating a lot of problems. Let's talk about this. And Obama, they listened, and there's some more discussion. And Cuba, as I mentioned, the Latin American countries came together, and kind of all of this history with respect to Bay of Pigs, et cetera, et cetera. It was always sort of seen in Latin America as David versus Goliath, and they're pressing Obama. You've got to, have a rapprochement with Cuba, and Obama indeed did that. Right, it was one of the reasons why Obama had the rapprochement with Cuba. So I see it as that there was this period where they were really working for Latin American presidents to kind of get a voice. But as you know, the summit last summer under Biden was basically, I would say, catastrophic. With AMLO, not attending, a number of the other leftist presidents, not attending this disagreement. There was no way Biden could invite Venezuela, Nicaragua to the summit and not be absolutely excoriated, in the U.S. Congress. So the division in the U.S., meaning he couldn't do that, and then the Latin America, the leftist countries excoriating him for that. So there was no chance to talk in many of these key issues that we need to talk about. Venezuela, let's talk. So I see that as, very, very unfortunate. And again, as you said, a chance to talk about what we can do to strengthen democratic institutions. And, obviously, as you said, my work, I'm very interested. I see electoral rules as kind of something that can be doable, something that we can do. And one of the things I recommended for Peru is, okay, if no candidate gets 30% in the first round, let's have a whole other round and send, people like going to the polls. It's not and plus it's a mandatory vote in most of these countries, and they don't have primaries. So you could do it, and then you wouldn't get this catastrophe that we had in Peru of, just 2 candidates. Now you'd have 5, say, and you'd be able to get somebody a little bit more to the center. Going ranked choice voting, I think is, I have a new article coming out with a colleague, on this issue. And I think it's got lots of potential in many, many ways in the United States. I think there's a need for work on it in the United States. I think in Latin America, it's too complicated. It wouldn't, the need for transparency when you eliminate candidates, I just think it's not viable at the moment. Maybe 20 years from now, it would be viable and would be good in a lot of ways, but not right now. So I think that effort, one of the things I recommended for Peru when I was talking to the Council on Foreign Relations a couple of weeks ago was more money for the pollsters so people could have an idea going into this and not have big surprises. That a lot of the polls in Latin America, not just Peru, are catastrophic a lot of the time. So people are totally surprised. And then the legitimacy of the election is tarnished, and the need for people to know who's the front runners are so that they can strategize their votes. And these pollsters don't have the money to get into the interior of the country a lot of times. So different things like that I think could be, again, talked about perhaps at these 4 a bit more. The National Electoral, what rules should we have so that the National Electoral Commissions are seen as legitimate? Lots of things we could talk about. So anyway, thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Cynthia, you've been great, and you're still enthusiastic and optimistic, which has also gone through somehow to the rest of us here in your audience and participating with you today. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn you back over to June, who's going to also thank you, I guess, as well as go on and tell about our next program. So I'm glad I found you. I'm glad you agreed. You were so enthusiastic in agreeing, and you've been great. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Well, indeed, I am going to thank you. And I think really for that whirlwind tour of South America, but yet I think being able to give personality and a sense of the issues for each of the countries as well. So I think both in terms of the overall picture of what's happening, you give us really a good foundation for kind of watching these countries and hoping that we will work out some of our relationships with them for the betterment, I think, of both countries as well, or all the countries. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to, share my thoughts, my views, my knowledge, and terrific questions. And it's really great to interact with people who are really eager to hear more. And so, thank you.
And
Thank you
Cynthia,
all.
it's great to know that there are people like you thinking about all these issues in a very focused, intelligent way. It's encouraging, really. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tyler, that was beautifully said and done. I agree with you
and I would
wholeheartedly.
also then like to talk about our next session. So this will be our last meeting of the spring discussion groups. And also there is a date change. So the next and last meeting will be May 1. So next Monday, 10 o'clock, same place. We will see you on Zoom, but please be sure and tune in on May 1. We have a wonderful speaker also, as have been all our speakers. Liana Fix. She is a fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. And we are very excited to be now going back to Europe and focusing on a country also very involved with NATO and the EU, which has the promise of, I think, hoping to unify some of the Europeans in sort of their approach to Ukraine, as well as to Russia and to China. So some very, very big issues, but also with their own internal issues that will shape their foreign policy. So we welcome you and to tune in May 1 next Monday. So thank you. And again, thank you so much, Cynthia. And I turn you back to Joan to say farewell.
And again, I just reiterate, thank you so much. It's, as Tyler said, it's wonderful to think that there are people like you on top of all this situation. And also your ability to explain it to us so clearly. Thank you. And again, we'll see you next week, which will be on May 1st at 10 o'clock. Please register on our website, which is chappaqua.library.org. And again, thank you to the Planning Committee for another great job. See you all later. Have a good week. Bye.